April 1241. The wind whispered over the hills of western Poland, cold and sharp like a blade. The villages slept unaware. Birds stopped singing. Even the rivers seemed to flow slower, as if nature itself sensed what was coming. Europe's finest knights were gathering, proud and confident. 50,000 men in shining armor, horses stamping the ground like thunder, swords and lances glinting under the pale spring sun. They called themselves the guardians of Christendom. They believed no enemy could break them. At the center rode Duke Henry the Pious, a man both fearless and devout. His armor reflected the morning light, and his sword gleamed as he whispered a prayer. May God guide my hand and protect the cross. Around him, men laughed. They told tales of past victories, of enemies crushed, castles taken, cities burned. They had faced armies before, but they had never faced this. Far to the east, something moved silently. Not men, not horses, shadows that rode like the wind itself. They were the Mongols, warriors bred for speed, precision, and death. Their bows curved like the crescent moon, their arrows faster than the eye could track. They spoke little, moved like predators, and obeyed their general Subutai without question. Subutai had studied these knights. He knew their pride. He knew their weakness. They relied on direct combat, on the weight of their armor and the roar of their charge. He would turn that confidence into a weapon against them. As the European camp awoke, armor clanging and banners snapping in the wind, no one noticed the mist rolling across the plains, thick, ghostly, and silent. The knights assumed it harmless in a morning fog, but in the fog the Mongols were already moving, slowly, silently, encircling, watching, waiting. The European soldiers laughed when they saw empty hills. The cowards have fled, they said. We shall have an easy victory. They were wrong. The first warning came at dawn. A low echoing horn sounded from the mist, not like any European trumpet, but wild, deep, and frightening. Horses neighed in terror. Men gripped their swords tighter. Shapes began to emerge, hundreds at first, then thousands. Shadows on horseback, impossible to count, riding like ghosts across the field, and then the arrows came. Rain of steel, swift, precise, deadly. Knights fell before they could even lift their shields. Horses screamed, throwing men to the muddy ground. Chaos erupted instantly. No one knew where to strike. No one could see the enemy clearly. Panic spread like fire. Pride turned to fear. The legendary European knights, warriors who had conquered armies and crusaded across continents, were trapped in a nightmare they could not understand. The Mongols did not attack with swords. They attacked minds, with deception, with speed, with terror. Every movement was calculated. Every knight drawn into confusion. Every arrow a message: you are not safe. You are not ready. You are not invincible. By the time the sun climbed higher, the first cries of dying men filled the air. Smoke from burning villages in the distance added to the suffocating dread. Europe had never faced an enemy like this. A shadow army that struck and disappeared, leaving death in its wake. And so began the fall of the Iron Cross. No one alive would forget the horror that swept across the plains of Legnica that day. The fog lingered over the fields of Legnica like a ghost refusing to leave. The European knights, still clutching their swords, strained to see through the white haze. The silence was unnatural, almost mocking. Birds no longer sang. Even the wind seemed afraid to move. Then the arrows struck again, hundreds, then thousands, cutting through the ranks like lightning tearing the sky. Armor did nothing to stop them. Horses fell screaming, and men were thrown to the ground, impaled before they even knew what hit them. Panic spread like wildfire. Duke Henry tried to rally his knights. "Hold your line! For God, for Europe!" he shouted, his voice trembling with urgency. But his words were drowned out by the relentless rain of arrows, the pounding hooves, and the screams of dying men. The Mongols appeared from nowhere, moving like shadows across the plains. One moment they were distant specks on the horizon. The next they were circling the knights, striking from the flanks, disappearing into the mist. These were no ordinary warriors. Every Mongol soldier knew his place. Every arrow was fired with deadly precision. Every charge, every retreat, every feint was a trap designed to confuse, exhaust, and terrify. The knights were trained for strength, for honor, for face-to-face combat. They relied on heavy armor and disciplined lines, but the Mongols ignored all rules. They were invisible phantoms striking with speed and cunning. Small groups of knights tried to break through the fog, only to be led into ambushes. Horses were cut down before they could charge. Men were separated from their comrades, surrounded and cut off. By the afternoon, the European lines were fractured. Confusion reigned. The proud banners of Christendom drooped in despair. In the chaos, Duke Henry remained calm, or at least he tried. He rode through the broken ranks, shouting commands, trying to restore order. But even he could see the truth. This was a war unlike any he had fought. This was not a battle of swords or lances. It was a war of fear, of strategy, of death raining from unseen eyes. Subutai watched from a distant hill, a phantom among phantoms. Every move of the knights had been anticipated. Every retreat, every charge, every desperate maneuver was already part of his plan. He had studied their psychology, their arrogance, their reliance on tradition, and now he exploited it with ruthless perfection. The Mongols would strike, then vanish. Strike again from another direction, draw the knights into traps, break their lines, crush their morale. Each hour that passed, the European forces became more desperate, more disorganized. By late afternoon, the battlefield was a nightmare. Smoke from burning villages filled the air. Arrows littered the ground like hail. Horses screamed in terror. Men shouted prayers they did not believe in. The proud European knights, champions of Christendom, were losing control, losing hope. And then came the sound that would haunt Europe for generations. The war cry of the Mongols, chilling, wild, unstoppable. It echoed over the plains, carrying a message that no armor could defend against. We are the storm. You cannot escape. You will fall. Europe had met the enemy it did not understand. The knights, once confident and untouchable, were now hunted men. Every strategy they had relied upon, every rule of combat had been turned against them. By nightfall, the fog thickened, hiding the Mongols' movements. The knights were trapped in a world of shadows, fear and confusion. They did not yet know it, but the coming days would see their forces decimated, their pride shattered, and the memory of this battle etched forever as a warning. Europe was not invincible. The shadows from the east were everywhere, and the storm had only just begun. The sun rose, but its light did little to pierce the fog of fear that hung over the plains of Legnica. Smoke drifted from burning farms and villages, carried by the wind like the scent of death. The screams of men and horses echoed endlessly, bouncing off the hills like a dark symphony. The European knights, once proud and confident, were now shadows of their former selves. Armor scratched and dented, weapons slick with mud and blood, their banners torn. Chaos reigned. Every attempt to form a line, every attempt to charge was met with arrows, ambushes, and cunning feints. Subutai had orchestrated this storm perfectly. His army moved like a single organism, fast, silent, and deadly. Mongol horsemen struck from one side, vanished, and reappeared from another. Their arrows fell with terrifying accuracy. Every attack was designed to confuse and demoralize, turning Europe's strongest warriors into hunted prey. Duke Henry the Pious rode through the carnage, trying to rally his men. He shouted commands, urging them to form ranks, to hold the line, to fight for Christendom. But the knights could barely hear him over the clamor of death. Fear had taken hold. Pride had crumbled. Even the bravest warriors trembled. The first major clash erupted near a small hill. Knights charged, believing a concentrated assault could break the Mongol formation. They thundered forward, lances aimed, horses galloping like storms of iron. But the Mongols were already retreating, drawing the knights into a trap. Suddenly, from the foggy flanks, arrows rained down. Knights were pierced through armor. Horses fell. Men screamed, flailing uselessly as their comrades tried to save them. Within minutes, the charge was shattered. The knights were surrounded, trapped in a whirlwind of death. Panic spread like wildfire. Some fled only to find themselves encircled again. Others fought desperately, but their swords struck empty air or glanced harmlessly off the nimble Mongols. Every tactic they had known was useless. Every move was anticipated. The battlefield was a living nightmare. Smoke and dust blurred the vision. Blood soaked the mud. Horses cried out in pain. Men screamed for God, for mercy, for their lives. Prayers swallowed by the chaos around them. Subutai watched it all, calm and methodical. Every maneuver the Europeans made played right into his hands. The Mongols did not simply fight. They controlled the battlefield. Every retreat was an illusion, every advance a trap. Within hours, what was supposed to be Europe's unstoppable army had turned into scattered, desperate groups, fighting not for victory, but for survival. By midday, Duke Henry saw the truth. His forces were broken. Pride, honor, and faith could not save them from this storm. Even he felt the weight of despair pressing down, heavy as the armor he wore. The Mongols pressed their advantage relentlessly. Fires spread across the plains, turning fog into choking smoke. Arrows flew without pause. The ground was littered with fallen knights and horses. Every attempt to regroup failed. Europe's mightiest warriors were crumbling under a strategy they could not understand, against an enemy they could not see. The cries of dying men filled the air like a dark hymn. This was not a battle. It was a slaughter, and it would go down in history as one of the most devastating defeats Christendom had ever known. By evening, the field was unrecognizable. Smoke and ash hung in the air. Bodies of men and horses littered the plains, the proud banners of Europe torn and soaked in blood. The knights had fought bravely, but against the Mongols, bravery alone was meaningless. The storm from the east had struck with devastating precision. 50,000 knights, the pride of Europe, had been thrown into chaos in just 3 days. By nightfall, the survivors were few, scattered and broken. Their world, their confidence, and their belief in invincibility had been shattered forever. The Mongols disappeared into the night as silently as they had come, leaving behind a field of death, fear, and silence. Europe would remember this day, not as a battle, but as a warning. Pride could be destroyed, and even the mightiest warriors could fall beneath a storm they never saw coming. The sun rose over a field of silence. Where once 50,000 knights had thundered across the plains of Legnica, now only shadows remained. Smoke lingered like a curse, curling into the sky from burning villages and shattered camps. The earth was torn, trampled, and soaked with blood. The proud banners of Christendom, symbols of power and faith, lay torn and soaked in mud. The survivors wandered like ghosts. Armor was battered, weapons broken, eyes hollow. Some wept openly. Others stared in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. Men who had once believed themselves invincible now realized they were fragile, human, fallible, and utterly unprepared for the storm from the east. Duke Henry the Pious had survived, but barely. His sword was nicked and bent, his armor dented, his hands shaking from exhaustion and grief. He had tried to rally his knights, tried to turn chaos into order, but the truth was impossible to ignore. Europe's strongest warriors had been destroyed not by brute force alone, but by strategy, speed, and terror. The Mongols had vanished as quickly as they came, leaving only the aftermath of devastation. Their precision had been terrifying. They had fought not for glory, but for efficiency. Each arrow, each maneuver, each ambush had been executed with perfect calculation. The field was a graveyard. Horses lay broken, men unrecognizable in death or injury. The smell of blood, smoke, and fear clung to the air, a suffocating reminder of the disaster. Survivors dragged themselves from the mud, searching desperately for comrades, only to find corpses where friends should have been. Across the European lands, news of the massacre spread like wildfire. Cities trembled. Kings and lords feared for their borders. The image of the Mongols, faceless, swift, unstoppable, haunted every mind. Europe had believed itself untouchable. Now Europe knew it was vulnerable. Even the clergy who had prayed for divine protection could only whisper in horror. Prayers seemed hollow in the face of such overwhelming loss. Faith, for once, could not shield the knights from fear, despair, or death. For decades, the Battle of Legnica would haunt the imagination of Europe. Songs of victory were replaced with tales of horror. Children were warned of the horsemen of the East. Scholars wrote of strategy and failure. Priests preached caution instead of courage. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical destruction. Duke Henry himself would carry the weight of this defeat until his death. The pride of Christendom had been broken, and Europe would remember the lesson. Arrogance, even among the mightiest, could be fatal. The Mongols had not only won a battle, they had shattered a legacy. Europe's elite knights, once the symbols of strength and invincibility, had been reduced to scattered survivors, their glory lost. And across the steppes, Subutai planned his next move. The Mongol Empire would continue its march westward, leaving a trail of fear and devastation in its wake. Europe had glimpsed a storm it could not yet face, a shadow from the east that would change the course of history forever. The field of Legnica remained, silent and somber, a dark testament to the collapse of glory. The Iron Cross had fallen, and the memory of that day would linger in Europe's heart as a warning. Even the proudest and strongest could be destroyed by strategy, speed, and terror. The news traveled slowly at first, carried by messengers on tired horses across the forests and mountains of Europe. Then it spread like wildfire, faster than any army could march. Legnica had fallen. 50,000 knights, Europe's pride, its strongest warriors, its shining symbols of Christendom, had been destroyed in just 3 days. In castles and towns, panic took root. Nobles and kings stared at maps, imagining Mongol hordes moving westward like a storm of shadow. Merchants whispered fearfully in market squares. Priests preached caution instead of courage. Europe had faced enemies before, but none like this, disciplined, invisible, unstoppable. For those who survived Legnica, life was never the same. Each sunrise reminded them of the screams, the smoke, the thunder of hooves, and the arrows that had fallen like rain. Many wandered aimlessly, haunted by the faces of friends and comrades lost. Some turned to God, praying for understanding, while others turned to despair, unable to grasp the scale of their defeat. The Mongols, meanwhile, vanished back into the vast lands of the east, leaving Europe broken but alive. Subutai's army was not there to occupy. It was there to destroy hope, to shatter pride, and to remind the world that arrogance could be fatal. Europe began to change. Military tactics evolved. Castles were reinforced, and armies studied the Mongols' methods for decades to come. The myth of invincible knights had been shattered. Europe realized that strength alone, armor, swords, and courage, could not guarantee survival. Intelligence, strategy, and adaptability were now as crucial as steel. Stories of the Mongols' lightning raids spread through generations, told as cautionary tales. Children were warned of riders who struck from the mist. Scholars debated strategy and wrote of the Battle of Legnica with reverence and fear. Every European knew that the shadow of the East could strike again. Duke Henry the Pious himself carried the memory of the battle until his death. He had survived physically, but the weight of failure, of witnessing the collapse of Europe's pride, lingered like a shadow over his life. The victory of the Mongols was not just on the battlefield. It was in the minds and hearts of all who learned of it. Legnica became a symbol, a dark chapter in European history that no knight, scholar, or king could ignore. It was a warning. Even the proudest armies could fall if they underestimated an enemy. Even the strongest warriors could be undone by speed, strategy, and terror. The Mongols had not just won a battle, they had rewritten the rules of warfare. Europe's invincibility had been shattered, and a shadow from the east now stretched across the continent, dark and unyielding. And in the silence of the fields of Legnica, where once banners flew and swords clashed, only the memory of that storm remained, a silent, grim reminder that history does not favor the proud, but the clever, the swift, and the unrelenting. Europe had glimpsed the future of war, a future where strategy, terror, and adaptability would decide the fate of nations. And for the survivors, every shadow, every distant horn, every whisper of horses on the horizon would forever carry the memory of the Mongols' unstoppable storm. The Iron Cross had fallen, and its shadow lingered over Christendom forever.